warm welcome to both our in-person audience and indeed our online audience. And I also want to particularly express our appreciation to our in-person audience who, after like 4 or 5 days of rain, who knows, it seems like it's been forever. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. It is much appreciated. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our first lecture of the season. And we will be fortunate enough that we have Monica Khemsurov and Jill Singer here tonight to discuss how to live with objects, a guide to more meaningful interiors. I want to mention that the book is available for purchase this evening, courtesy from Books on Call, who is at the back of the room, and indeed online viewers can purchase it through bookshop.org. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785. We are a non-profit organization, and we were founded by skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, our 238-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, of course, of which we're in this evening, the John M. Mossman Lock Museum, which is upstairs, and you're welcome to visit it after tonight's talk. And finally, our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which tonight's program is part of. Monica Khemsurov and Jill Singer are co-founders of the online magazine Sight Unseen, one of the most influential design publications in the United States, and we're really pleased they can be here this evening. They are former editors of ID magazine, and they also work as freelance writers, curators, and consultants. Monica is a contributing editor for T, the New York Times style magazine, and a contributor to Bon Appetit, Bloomberg Business Week, and W. While Jill's writing has appeared in Pinup, Elle Decor, T, the New York Times style magazine, W, and much more. Both live and work in New York City. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Monica Khemsurov and Jill Singer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys for coming despite this weather. We're so happy to be here with all of you. I'm just going to introduce Sight Unseen in general and tell you a little bit more about how it was founded and what we do, which is the background context for this book. So we founded Sight Unseen together in 2009, and originally it was a website, sort of an online magazine, where the idea, hence the name, was to show people behind the scenes of the design world. So the idea was to get a glimpse into the lives of makers, designers, artists, and also to see their homes, to see their studios, and to really understand the stories behind products, design objects, and really give people a glimpse into that world, even who weren't involved directly in the design scene. So we started out as an online magazine. We still are. We've branched into many other places then, but this behind the scenes view was really the idea. So we wrote all sorts of articles, like I said, studio visits, news articles, interviews, just clever ways of looking at people's practices in an unusual behind the scenes way. But sort of our favorite realm of coverage for Sight Unseen was always house tours, and seeing how people lived. And so this is the site. This is the site now. It looks very different from how it was when we started in 2009, much better. But so these house tours that we did were a little bit special because they were very different from what we think of as house tours in shelter magazines, for example, because our idea was not to highlight people's interior design per se, but more to show the objects that they lived with, the things that inspired them, and sort of what their personal style was at home. And we did photograph people's homes for Sight Unseen very early on. They often looked a little bit more messy or a little bit more, personality filled. And it was always spaces that were full of objects. At the beginning, when we started Sight Unseen, most of our photographs didn't look this good because we were shooting everything ourselves, which was back on. But the general idea was that it was about people's stuff. So for example, if you read sort of fancy shelter magazines, on the left is kind of what those house tours usually look like, where it's very polished, very pristine, and minimalist, perfect. And then on the right is more what our aesthetic always was, starting at the beginning. It was really not necessarily about like hoarders, but about people who love stuff. And we would go into people's homes and say, hey, we want to come photograph your house, but don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. We want to see your mess. We want you to pull things out of drawers. Like, that's really what we're interested in, is like seeing the things that you own. And here's just another example where, you have a shelter magazine on the left, and then you have one of Sight Unseen's early house tours where it's just like a picture of the junk in someone's kitchen, but then there's like a cute little planter there that, so the idea was like, okay, let's look at people's real lives. And for us, that was about their possessions. So this was sort of what led up to our idea for the book, because when the pandemic hit, we actually got an email from an amazing agent, Catherine Cowles, who's here tonight, thank you. And she approached us about doing a book because she said, hey, it's a pandemic, everyone's sitting at home looking around, thinking about their homes, thinking about the things that they live with, and it's a good time for books about interiors. So she was actually the one who proposed to us that we do a book. And, our first thought was immediately, okay, like how can we do a book about interiors that feels genuine to us, that feels like what we care about and what we love? And almost immediately we came up with the name How to Live with Objects, because for us, it's really about the stuff. And the stuff is what we wanted to show people. So we kind of developed the book around this idea of an object-based interior, where it's more about putting people's personalities on view and how their personalities reflected in their interiors, as opposed to, these beautiful spaces that, are maybe not so realistic for everyone. So yeah, so the idea was of the book from the beginning was, showing interiors as a collection of your best, most personal, most meaningful objects. And that it's really what you surround yourself with that, contributes to you personal space. And the fact that, we look at interiors as a reflection of the people who live in them, and we don't want them to look like catalogs or look, generic, or look like you don't know who's living there. So that was always the idea, and that was our first, like, this is what we're going to do a book about. This is the only thing we want to do a book about, and that led to this. So I'm going to pass it to Bill, who's going to tell you more about what was happening in culture at the time, and why it set the stage for an approach to our book.
So I'm going to paint a little bit more of a picture of what the design world was like when we founded Sight Unseen. Instagram hadn't been founded. Social media, I think, was pretty much confined to Twitter and Facebook at that point. There's another pretty well-known magazine in the interiors world called Apartamento, and that had just been founded. And that was a similar vibe to what we were trying to achieve, of catching people in these more unstudied moments and talking to them about maybe what the pieces in their home meant to them on a molecular level, or what kind of sort of just meaning they derived from their stuff. And design at the time, it's changed so much in the last 15 years, which is partially like what led up to us thinking that we had the authority to write a book. Because at the time in 2009, and I can say this as someone who grew up not even knowing what design was, it was really much more of a niche thing. People were interested in stuff, I think, but the idea hadn't come to the surface that oh, maybe I would want to know all this context about the way in which this thing I acquired was. And at the time, there was the slow food movement. There were these things happening around the culture in other areas. And I have sort of pictures here of, there's an image from a blog called Into the Gloss that led people inside, influencers and celebrities and editors, medicine cabinets. There's one from a site called The Coveteur that led people into closets. There were sites called The Selby, there was this whole sort of circular context happening where people wanted to really throw back the curtain. So that's the context in which Sight Unseen was founded. And over the past 15 years, we were really interested in this from the start, in putting the focus on design and putting the focus on objects. And we kind of had a little bit of an upward struggle at the beginning because people weren't as interested. But over the past 15 years, in part because of things like social media and the fact that your life is really on display at all times, and in part due to things like, our site for one, and other things, design has really reached this unprecedented level of mass appeal. I have some images up here of objects that formerly were well known in design circles, like an Ettore Satsas mirror, or these Herman Miller couches, or these Soriana sofas. And they started to be just, photographed in high profile interiors, on the covers of magazines. But then something started to happen where it began to trickle down and everyone wanted these things. So I think, when Kitty approached us to write the book, it was because we had really been at the center of this thing that had now kind of reached its tentacles into every aspect of society. We have, we talk a lot in the book about how personal narrative has become the driving force in decorating. And part of it, as I said, is because your life really is on display, even if you're not on social media, even if you're just doing now Zoom calls, if you're doing Google Meets, people can see into your life, and you're in touch with so many more people than you would have been even 15 years ago on a day-to-day basis. And before, you might have worn something that kind of telegraphed your style to the outside world. But now you want to fill your home with things that also say something about you and your personality. And so that was kind of where we started with our book. I'm gonna let Monica talk about why we find objects. Sorry, I do want to show Miley. This really reached a celebrity level too, where Miley Cyrus is now posing with this Ettore Satsas bookcase that would have not really been. What's on the right? That's an Australian singer. Oh, okay. I don't even know.
Okay, yeah, so that's sort of where we were at when we decided to do a book about this. But I do want to explain that when we talk about objects in people's homes, it's not about objects just being cool or objects being interesting or beautiful. We actually believe that objects have a certain power and a certain emotional impact. And I think that was also a driving force behind our book, and it's something we talk about a lot in our book, is this idea that objects don't just sit there, they really have an impact in a space and on people. So this is sort of a framing quote for our book. It really explains kind of the gist of this idea of objects being powerful. And it just says, imbued with the stories of where they came from and why we chose them, Our objects radiate meaning into our space, triggering us to remember, feel, or think, while giving our guests a tangible sense of our personality. More than any other element of our interiors, they are what make our homes definitively ours. And there's actually a little anecdote in the book that I really love, which is a few years ago, I did an interview with a designer who makes these objects where they're sort of enigmatic and you can't tell what they're for, like they sort of look sculptural. And so, I asked him if any of his pieces have a function, and he actually said that the function of his work was to exert an energy into the room. And I loved that because I was like, you don't think about that as a function of an object, but in fact, it's actually really true. The way that objects can change the energy of a space. So this quote is a little bit wordy, but you can break it down into these 3 sort of points, which is that objects tell stories, which is sort of self-explanatory. The objects we own often have a story attached to them, and it could be about where we found the object, or who gave us the object, or what we were doing when we acquired it. Were we traveling? Was it a special moment in our lives? Or did we just get it when we were really excited about a new home we moved into, and that's the piece that made our home feel more homey? But every object, not every object, but the objects that we talk about, which are objects that are more aesthetic or meaningful, they have a story like attached to them. And it also can build connections between people because other people's objects have stories as well. So if you visit someone's home or they visit yours, they can sort of build a bridge that connects people when you share those stories. Objects also make us feel, which, if you look at an object that you did buy on a trip that was one of your favorite trips or had meaning to you, you will always feel something when you remember that memory that's attached to the object. Or it might just be that the object makes you feel good, which is really powerful too. And that's also part of the story of why we wrote this book, because, when I was home during the pandemic and looking around my house, I was like, I live alone, I'm super lonely, and these are the things that are making me feel comfortable and keeping me company. And it was really like having feelings about and with my objects that kind of kept me comforted, like during that time at home. And the third one is objects reflect us, which is sort of what we've been talking about, which is, the way that objects can make us feel, make a space feel less generic and more like yours. These are just some cute photos, like outtakes of the portraits for our book, where people were having a moment with their objects. And I like it because it just embodies this idea that you can feel really connected to your objects and they can make you happy. So the other big introductory point of our book is the fact that anyone can do this. And we really loved, when we started thinking about this book, the idea that this approach is so accessible. And when you shift your way of thinking about interiors from some, really big, unreachable, perfect interior to an object-based view of interiors, all of a sudden, it's just so much more something like that anyone can do and something more accessible. Which, it's great that when interiors are aspirational, obviously, you want to make your home look amazing, but this is what we really love about this way of thinking about our homes, because you really don't need to be a decorator to just think about the objects that you surround yourself with and use that as the basis for your interior, because, decorators are more thinking about the concept of a space as a whole and like the vision of a space, whereas in the object view, you're really thinking about the stuff itself, and it's like a little bit more of a micro view of, your space. And then you don't need to be a collector, which is really important, because I think people get intimidated by the word collector and they think that it only means one thing, which is, investing in really expensive items and having the knowledge to do that. And in our way of thinking about interiors, you actually don't need to have the knowledge. I mean, it's great if you do, but it's really about trying to tune into the feeling you get about an object and think more about that sort of instinctive feeling you get when you feel connected to something, when you either because you love it or because it has a meaning to you. So, you know, a collector doesn't have to really be so scary anymore. It just means buying things that you really truly love and that you will want to live with for a long time. And another point that I loved in the book was about the collector, I always forget his name wrong, Albert C. Barnes, sorry, from the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. And I love bringing him up as an example because he was a huge collector. He has a whole museum in Philadelphia dedicated to his collection. You know, he was extremely wealthy. He owned original art by Matisse, but his philosophy of collecting was that you could put like a piece of stone that you found on the ground, or he had a collection of 887 pieces of wrought iron, just you know, regular wrought iron made by a craftsperson or whomever. And in his collection at the museum, it's all mixed together. So you might have a Picasso or a Matisse, but it might be next to some anonymous object that, you know, is just something he found on the street. And I love that idea because it's like, it does not diminish the value of, you know, this very expensive art to have something beautiful next to it that has a dialogue with it. So you don't have to be a collector. And then you don't need to have a perfect house, which is important because a lot of people, when they look at shelter magazines, these are homes that so much money has been put into renovating, you know, and making perfect, and all the stuff inside it is really expensive. But even if you have a rental and you can't change the bones of the rental, if all you're worried about is filling it with objects you love, then it still can be this beautiful personal space. And then you don't need to be a maximalist because it sounds like it from the photos we've shown that you have to like fill your house full of stuff, but you don't have to do that. I mean, even we have people we featured in the book who live in a very minimalist beige space, and then they have 3 things that are really meaningful to them on pedestals, and that is still very much, you know, part of our approach. So yes, this is the introduction, and now we're going to, oh, sorry, one more thing. This quote I thought was really amazing. So this is a quote from Alex Gilbert, who's Associate Director of Friedman Benda Design Gallery in New York, and she said, "I think the best interiors are less contrived and more emotionally driven, so it's more about how they make you feel than how they look. Our apartment isn't designed, it's just an assemblage of things we like." So she sort of nailed it. And now Jill's going to talk about the 4 types of objects that we discussed in our book with some fun examples.
So when we started thinking about the structure of our book, we tried to sort of think about like a taxonomy of objects and what are the different kinds of objects that generally make up a home. And 2 of the categories were really obvious to us, both vintage objects and objects. I think of the 2 of us, Monica is more of the vintage fiend, and I am more of like the contemporary collector. We're kind of obvious. But then we started to think about it, and a lot of the categories that we chose overlap with each other, but 2 of the other ones are the handmade object, which could obviously be vintage or contemporary, and the sentimental object, which is something you might acquire through a different way, like as a gift or a souvenir or something like that. But one of our favorite things to discuss is vintage. So we started with that actually, and it's honestly like one of the chunkiest parts of the book. You know, a lot of what we've been talking about is how you show yourself to the world and how you build kind of like a personal style that is meaningful to you. And so much of that, because there's the same information is available to everybody all the time at this point, is finding something that's different and uniquely yours. And we find that one of the easiest ways to do that is through sourcing vintage. You know, and it's even gotten to the point where even if you don't acquire the object, even if you just are the person who locates it in an old design book or in an exhibition catalog or in a museum exhibition, it has some sort of social currency because you've sort of like found this thing that nobody else has, which in some ways it's kind of annoying, but it's also nice when you get like that nice feeling when you do find it. There's this quote in the book about Diana Vreeland where she says, one thing, style, all who have it share one thing, originality. And while she was referring to fashion, the same is true of interiors. All of the great ones have like a very distinct point of view, a very strong personality. And we thought that when it comes to making a space really, really unique, vintage is the way to do it. You could be someone who's recently graduated from school and you go and you buy a bunch of stuff that you kind of need, which is something we also talk about in the book is in terms of like how to build a home. But even if you had all things from like CB2 or IKEA or the vintage pieces are the things that kind of like give your house like a soul. Part of the reason we love vintage so much, there's some of the pieces that appear in the book, is because vintage has what we refer to in the book, it's a quote from a friend of ours, as a mystery and a history. Vintage has a built-in story when you buy it. When you pick something off the table or in a store, it makes you wonder things like, who made this? Like, what kind of life did this thing live before it got to me? Like, what was the context in which this thing came into the world? And in terms of building a narrative, when you're acquiring a piece of vintage, you can kind of talk to the person who's selling you about it. You can do research, and also sort of like what we were talking before, some of these vintage pieces has kind of acquired a certain like cachet in design circles. But some of the other reasons we like vintage, and one of the piece on the right is an old IKEA piece, which is no longer a democratic. Sorry? On the left. Sorry, the piece on the left is an old IKEA piece from the 80s, which is probably no longer priced at an accessible point. But we do think that adding vintage in your life is a good way to get pieces that have like an added value. Things are contemporary objects are generally more expensive. And while vintage objects obviously can be too, if you've been on First Dibs, you've seen the same sofas I have that are $30,000. It can be a way to acquire like a smaller piece that's a little bit more accessible. We also like vintage pieces because it's like a really easy way to try on a trend without committing to a whole room or a hugely expensive piece. This piece on the right is a teapot from one of our favorite online vintage shops, Casa Shop. And just generally, we find that vintage offers an aesthetic that you just like simply can't find today. This piece on the left is from a London shop called Bet and Brute, and yeah, it's just one of our favorites. So we also offer a bunch of like tips in the book about how to acquire these various types of objects. For vintage, one of my favorite tips is if you're going to be shopping for vintage online, making sure you set search terms for each place you go to. So let's say you're going to eBay and you're interested in Murano, like a Murano glass pencil lamp. So you set Murano glass pencil lamp. Every time somebody posts it, it comes to you in like a daily digest. Another favorite tip is when you're shopping, and this is one of Monica's actually, is when you're shopping for vintage in real life, start with the weirdest thing on the table. Maybe it ends up that you don't buy it at all, but sometimes the weirdest thing on the table has the most interesting story behind it, and that's going to be the thing you feel the most connection to. Try not to get too emotionally invested in any one piece, because that's when you sort of start to make mistakes, but obviously like you do need to have that connection to it, and then look for potential, not perfection. The contemporary object. The contemporary object is probably my favorite thing to talk about. We've been, devoting our lives for the past 15 years to current makers for the most part. And as Monica said at the beginning, one of the reasons we even started Sight Unseen is we just really loved to talk to people about why they make things and how they make things. And when I started thinking about contemporary objects, I kind of was like, what even makes a contemporary object besides the fact that it's made now? And I think one of the most interesting things about contemporary objects, and contemporary objects can be so many things. It can be something you bought at the coffee shop in your neighborhood. It can be a piece you bought from a design gallery. It can be so many different things, but I thought that some of the things that like define them are exploring new technologies, exploring new materials and processes, sort of like reflecting the current trends, engaging with current social and cultural issues, or inventing a historical form in some sort of novel way. So we started to think about like some of our favorite contemporary objects, and these are two of my favorites in the book. The one on the left is by a London firm, and to look at it, it's a wooden table. But then when you know the story of it, they got these sort of squiggly forms by using a tool in Photoshop called the hard round tool. And they sort of made these drawings and translated them into a piece that they could then cut out in wood, which I thought was really great. And then the piece on the right is a piece I have in my own house that I actually built an entire bathroom around. And it's this toilet paper that's made from extruded plastic that he basically like shoots out of a gun and kind of like sculpts it in midair. And every time I, every time I use the toilet, it's this really kind of, it makes me giggle. It makes me think of the time in which I bought it, which was like in the middle of the pandemic. And I was kind of like, as Monica said, like looking for little things that might bring me joy. And then I just, and he's made so many, the designer who does this is a guy named James Shaw in London, and he's made so many other pieces with this same technique. So, it's nice to me that this one object that I spent like $45 on can kind of like embody all these different things to me. I know. Another thing about contemporary objects that we talk about in the book is how so many of them can be inaccessibly priced. And so we talk a little bit about how, I'm going to answer this with the shopping tips, but just, sort of keeping an eye out for, well, one of the ways in which I say to keep up with even what's happening in contemporary design is to obviously follow these designers on Instagram. But these are two examples of items that started out really expensive and then got licensed to a manufacturer, and now they're available at a much friendlier price point, and these as well. For contemporary pieces, it's a good idea, as I said, to keep an eye out for things that have been, made for the mass market now. Follow your favorite makers on Instagram, and I said bartering is your friend, but I'm not sure if that one's relevant. Yeah, and always be on the lookout for things you love. For the handmade object, as I was saying, we thought a lot about like how it's possible to express yourself when everyone does start to have the same kind of stuff. And handmade objects, I think, have a lot of importance and currency because each one is different. And so these are some of our favorites from the handmade section. This one on the left is made by a guy who sculpts in ceramic and then puts the ceramic piece on like a body vibration plate that's usually used for exercise. So it kind of jiggles into place, which I thought was a interesting story. And the one on the right is made by a designer in Detroit who uses like metallic candy wrappers to create this effect all over. The sentimental object section is an interesting one because, and we're going to sort of bring this all together at the end when we talk about styling a house. But sentimental objects are kind of the pieces that you bring into your house that don't necessarily have an obvious destination. Like maybe you acquired them through a friend and maybe they don't really even feel like you, but you want to keep this piece because it means something, because of how it came into your life. But because they're outside of the realm of aesthetic considerations, I think they become even more powerful because they have such a like strong story, whether it's an heirloom that you inherited from a grandparent, or a gift you got from a friend, or a souvenir you got from the trip you took around the world. So these are some of our personal sentimental objects. The one on the left is a piece I got on one of my many trips to Stockholm, and the cubes on the right are a piece that Monica grew up with in her home. Sorry. And these are just some of our friends' sort of sentimental objects as well. I'm hurrying this up a little bit because we're running out of time. And I'm going to let Monica talk about how we sort of bring all these things together.
So the last chapter in the book, after we do much more talking in the book about the various types of objects and how to purchase them, or how to think about them and appreciate them, is about styling. Because when you talk about an interiors book or an approach to interiors, obviously the missing piece is going to be, how do you put them into your home and how do you build a home out of them? So the book is not really about styling, but there is a part where we talk about it, because you can have all the nice objects in the world, but you still want them to look good in your space. So these are just a couple of really basic styling principles that we talk about in the book. Letting objects breathe just means that if you have something special, you want to make sure it's not crowded out. You want to make sure it has a spotlight or has the room to kind of like speak in your space. Juxtaposing and layering is just this idea that it's okay and in fact wonderful if you mix things up in your space. So you can mix in natural and man-made, you can mix in vintage and contemporary, you can mix in anonymous objects with attributed ones. And some people really love one era of design or of interiors and they want to live in only that era, but most of us in our real lives have many influences and interests, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with putting them in a big jumble in your space through your objects. And finding balance just means sort of taking an instinctual visual approach to how to balance objects with each other, which in playing with scale of objects, making sure something really tiny doesn't go next to something really huge and confuse the eye. So it's really about like assessing your space and grouping things in a way that sort of have a visual harmony together. Repositioning and repurposing is important because we believe that you don't really want to live in a museum. So personal interiors aren't really about like, we're going to put these things here and we're never going to touch them, because that's just sort of like a really, not really an alive way of living at home. So it's just the idea that, every once in a while change things, move things around. Like if you hate a piece, think about where else in your home you could put it that maybe you'll fall in love with it again. And that's also a great way to not get rid of things, and to have like a more timeless mindset about your objects, is playing with the way that they're arranged in your space. It can make you discover something new. And then the art of the edit is just this idea of making sure you're very conscious of how much you buy, and not purchasing things on a whim just because you like them, but really thinking about, do I have a space for this? Is this something I feel a strong connection to? And can I just take a photo of it instead? And we always say, if you aren't sure how you feel about an object, just put it in a closet for a couple months. And if you never think about it again, then you probably don't need to keep living with it. You can sell it or give it away. That's my approach anyway. I tend to have too many objects at home. About that a lot. So there's a bunch of styling tips in the book. I only spotlighted a couple in these two slides. And one that I really love is this idea that shelves can be about quantity, but surfaces should be about quality. And that idea is that if you have shelves, you can just load them up with tons of stuff and it'll look great. But if you have a surface like a coffee table or a console table, you want to have like a little bit more of a measured approach to the objects that you put on. It doesn't mean you have to only have a couple, you can have as many as you want, but it's more about the way you curate it and arrange it on a surface, whereas on a shelf you can have more fun, because shelves themselves have like sort of a spatial organization built in. And then the next is this one weird thing idea, which I love this, like the hand coming over the chair. And you could have more than one weird thing, of course, but it's fun to like have an interior that's very considered and then to throw something out of left field into the interior to sort of give people a connection point or make them smile. And then book stacks are a really important way of styling objects in an interior. This is an extreme version, but they can help you create balance. They can help you with spatial positioning. They can also help you get more of your personality into the space with the books that you love. But often when people are feeling like a surface or a space is too empty, books are a great way to kind of build them up and spotlight your objects. So to conclude, we have a couple more minutes. We put some of the photos of some of the interiors in our book at the end here, and the book was a book about interiors, but a large part of the book is more talking about our ideas and talking about objects. But in each chapter, we did shoot a couple of homes that felt relevant to that chapter. And that was actually a large part of the time we spent on the book was spent on finding the perfect homes, because actually, if you go to find homes to put in a book, you'll find a lot of homes that are really, really, really beautifully designed, which is more on the Shelter magazine side, if you recall at the beginning of the talk. And then you'll find a lot of homes that have really cool objects, but it's often hard to find homes that do both, that have the really cool objects, but also look beautiful enough to be spotlighted in a coffee table book. So we spent about 6 months finding the right homes for the book. This is one of them in London. And what I like about this one is I don't know if you can tell, but it's a very eclectic mix of types of objects, because he has a coffee table that he's a data analyst for like a bank, but he actually has a creative side, and he designed this coffee table and built it with a fabricator designer that he loves. So there's pieces in here that are vintage, there's pieces that he doesn't even know what they are, there's pieces from famous design brands, the chair on the left, and then there's pieces from young designers, the lamp on the right, and then in the middle there's a piece from a craftsman. So it's a mix of all different types of objects in one space, and it's just so vibrant. I don't know. We really loved this one. This space is a woman who's a curator and a stylist in Brussels. And the thing that I like about this image is that they originally were living in small apartments, and this apartment is a huge loft. It used to be a lamp factory. And they were so confused about how to live in a huge space after living in tiny apartments that they rushed out, and they're like, okay, we have to get like big furniture to fill this space. So she's like a bartender. She and her husband have been going to flea markets since they were little kids, and they like love finding a deal. So she found this table on like their version of Craigslist. It was a conference table from a man who was shutting down his office. And originally the table was like black and like a really ugly shade of orange. And it was $80, 80 euros. And she actually, her father, when she was young, kind of taught her how to rehab pieces and give them a new life. And so she grabbed this piece for 80 bucks. Did not look cool at all. And she painted it all this shade of like butter yellow or whatever, and like made it into a piece that really felt like her. And that, she now has a special connection to the piece because she had a hand in, creating it. So I really love that story. Then this is an amazing space in LA that belongs to Jonathan Pessin, who's a eccentric dealer of mostly vintage objects. And this is only one small part of his house. In the book, there's many more pictures of it, and they're much crazier than this, because he's just like, he's a crazy collector. Like, he has just so much insane stuff. And his whole deal is that he doesn't like anything like normal or like with a normal function, like to be absurd or like out of scale or have a weird function or be, crazy way. And the funny part about him is that his business is called Not for Sale because he says he has a superpower when he walks into a store of picking out the exact piece that's always the one that's not for sale. And he does it in his business as well because he's so connected to all the objects that he collects that he often doesn't want to give them up. And it takes time for him to actually offer them for sale, even though that is his business. So it's kind of like a joke. But his space is amazing. And then this one is Kim Mupangeli. She lives in New York. And what I liked about this photo is that she was born and raised in Belgium, but she's Belgian Congolese. And her father, when he left Africa to immigrate to Europe in the 1970s, brought a few pieces with him by African artisans. And the tall piece in the middle is one piece that her father gave her from that collection. And what's so cool about it is like she's young and she has this sort of very hip kind of aesthetic. She's also a dealer of objects. And it's just so interesting to see how this piece that her father brought with him is already like so similar to the pieces that she loves herself, even whether it's like, with probably a Danish bowl. But, just it's like a piece of her history, but it's also so connected to her personal aesthetic. This is the home of Sue Wu in Mexico City. She's a curator. And the cool part about her house is that she buys a lot of things from flea markets. Like the ear was from the biggest flea market in Mexico City. But her house is entirely full of pieces that were either gifts from designers and artists that she wrote about or worked with, or like prototypes, because she pieces that were experiments, like when a maker is experimenting with something and maybe it comes out like kind of wonky or not quite right or isn't like a finished thought. Those are the objects that she really loves because she feels like they're super one of a kind and really reflects something about the people who made them and the headspace they were in. So a lot of hers are gifts, prototypes, and weird vintage finds, and a lot of them are gifted to her by friends or friends. And the last one before we'll stop for questions is this shelf in the home of Sadie Perry in London. She's also an object dealer as well as a jewelry designer. And I just really like this because it's that idea of like just having a bunch of stuff that you love and you can't stop buying things you love and you just throw them all on a shelf and somehow there's a dialogue between them and about your personal style. She really loves pairing things that are like metal and perfectly shaped with things that are organic and imperfect. So throughout her house, you see this juxtaposition of styles and juxtaposition between textures and between man-made and man-made. And we just really think this is a lovely way to live, just being surrounded by things that are beautiful. So that concludes our talk about our book. Do you ask the question or do you? Does anyone have any, and this includes the people listening from the online world?
Right. Have we a question over here? No. Okay. There we go.
Well, first of all, thank you for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
You've opened my mind.
Oh, I love that.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about vintage. How was vintage regarded before it became vintage? And did it become vintage by being somebody else's reject? Thank you.
You mean before the objects themselves became vintage? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not trying to know how to answer it, but do you want to? Yeah.
I'll start. I think it obviously depends on the object. I mean, there were a lot of
beautiful part about vintage.
Right. There were a lot of pieces. I mean, first of all, I will also say that when we talk about vintage, we're not be anonymous crafts things as well. And sure, there were like a lot of things that were kind of rejected in their time, and the same things are now maybe, as being too weird or too gauche or too something. So it's nice when those pieces find a new life now, but obviously there's tons of stuff that was well loved and well regarded in its time, and simply became available now through any number of circumstances, including, the owners no longer being with us.
That's amazing.
But yeah, go ahead.
Actually, I also want to say that my parents hated anything old, hated, like if something was old or it was worn, they just got rid of it. And so I got upset when I got older because I was like, I would have loved to have all these things that you lived with. They were quite beautiful, but some people just think that old is bad is good. And I think that that's a nice thing about vintage, where it's like, if you appreciate vintage, it can be something that is a little worn out or does have damage or isn't perfect. And, for me, that's more beautiful, not for everyone.
Somebody else's reject then.
Yeah.
Well, as my mother says, who I think she's also watching right now, when she sees things that come back around that were popular when she was my age, she's like, been there, done that. So it's not everyone's cup of tea.
Right. Do we have any more questions? Yes.
Thank you for this. I started my career buying for film sets and definitely believe in the power of individual objects, no matter what they are, but just to infuse that sense of personality into a space. Maybe this question is wishful thinking. I actually just opened a vintage and contemporary design shop in Chinatown, and I'm wondering if you're seeing, or if you have a preference for a resurgence of in real life shopping.
Versus online, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, I think it never died. I don't, especially when it comes to vintage. I think that it's like, in a way, it's really nice to encounter the object in person and see the patina and feel it. And, I think that when possible to shop in, you do start to understand like what you're feeling about the bee and connect with the thing in real life. I think that the reason why online got so huge is just because of access. Not everyone knows where to hunt for these things or has the time to hunt for them. And so online is great for that. But I think that in person is just like a nice discover things. But I don't think it ever went out of style. I think it just got harder to have an in-person space because everything's so expensive now.
I think that it makes it so you make fewer mistakes. We talk in the book about how it's actually okay to make mistakes, and part of making mistakes is it's like part of the process and understanding your own style. When you bring something in and you're like, oh, actually, this is not right. But it's easier not to make a mistake when you can actually hold it in your hand. I just bought a set of napkin rings online, and I thought, I grew up with napkin rings, and my daughter has expressed wanting napkin rings, and I thought that they would be like this nice thing to like bring into our home, and then I got them, and it just wasn't the same.
Good luck with your.
And just to add to that, I used to always go to the Chelsea flea market, and our apartment so much dates to when it was really good in the early 2000s.
So sad.
Beautiful pagoda chairs and frame things. But one of the things in support of your in-person venture is my sister and I used to love the vendors and seeing what they had and having a relationship with them, and you really get to know people over time. And then they would look for things for you. So you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And they also teach you about the objects so that you have a more informed approach to purchasing them. Yeah.
Yes, we have a question at the back.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I think we've all purchased things, and then a few years later, we feel like they've gone out of style, and you want to throw them away, or you can't get as much money for them.
Paint it.
Okay, well,
really
that was my question.
Paint it.
Okay, that's a two-part question now because you inspired a second part. First is, do you have tips for like buying things that are timeless? And second would be like, or Monica, do you have any hot tips for what to do with something in a pinch when you don't want to throw it away?
Well, for buying things that are timeless, you know, that's a hard one. Part of it is simply looking for things like materials that are timeless, and not necessarily, you know, let's say like natural materials, wood, marble, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, there's plenty of contemporary objects that are made of like resin and foam that, you know, you would want to have forever too. So that's kind of one piece of the puzzle. But I think a lot of it is being aware of what is currently trending and kind of like interrogating yourself. Do I really want this piece because I see it everywhere and it's being like pounded into my head that this is something that I should have? Or is it really part of my aesthetic? Does it say something about me or my personality or my home or my family? So just kind of like taking a sec to do that little like questionnaire in your head is sometimes a good one. And then, you know, like Monica had talked about, like putting it in the closet, you know, is it something you could simply take a picture of in the store and, you know, you'll have it on your phone forever, but then you maybe didn't bring it into your house and then think 2 years later, why did I do that?
I was just going to say another thing we talk about in the book is that vintage is a great way to play. So if you can find vintage objects that maybe you're not investing so much money in and you know they already had a life before and you don't feel guilty about, you know, using material resources, you can play around a lot with vintage. So like if you do want to do something vibey or styly that you're like, oh, I might hate this in 6 months, like that's when you just go get vintage stuff and have more fun and be crazy with the vintage. But yeah, I think if you don't like it anymore, you can always donate it or find a friend who wants it.
Right. Continuing on the vintage theme, what would be your favorite vintage stores in New York or flea markets? I'll add that.
Well, the flea market scene in New York is not so good anymore. So I do flea markets elsewhere. But vintage-wise, it's hard. I don't shop for vintage in New York because it is so expensive. I say I get most of my stuff online. Jill, do you have?
I also get most of my stuff online.
But if we did have endless resources, there are some stores or dealers in New York
Right.
that we love, like Somerset House.
Yeah, Somerset House is a good one.
What else?
There's
There's got to be a bunch. Lycan has some vintage, Lycan in Brooklyn. There's so many, but whenever people ask for a list, I go blank. There's some mention in the book. You could buy the book.
Right.
But yeah, I mostly shop online. Like I shop on Live Auctioneers. I shop on, there's a place in Florida called Villa Object that I like. It's like a bit more marked up because she knows what she has. But it's easy. And as I mentioned before, Casa Shop in Virginia is also a great one, especially for more anonymous things.
I also really like the thrill of the hunt, so I don't necessarily shop through other curators. I like to find the stuff myself. And that means like scouring, like, you know, eBay, Craigslist, stuff like that, so.
Okay, I don't know if the online audience heard that, but the
Joanna Frank Design Shop.
Exactly, Joanne Franklin on.
Joanna Frank, Design Shop, yeah. And I have a lot of weird things on the table.
Great. We didn't talk enough about weird in this talk, but it is really important.
Do we have any more questions? Well, in that case, I think I would like to express our gratitude to you both for this wonderful, illuminating talk. I have learned some things. For instance, all that IKEA stuff that I'm desperate to get rid of, well, if I hold on to it, maybe in 40 years.
It could be vintage. It could be vintage.
So that was it. And I also really like the tip about the shells and the surfaces. And of course, I know there's so much more. And I also want to remind both our in-person audience and our online audience that this wonderful, wonderful book is available for purchase tonight. And I think Monica and Jill would be happy to autograph it. But I also want to express our thanks to Kitty for suggesting this book and this topic. But it really has, it's been so insightful, and we're so grateful for you participating in our programs and lectures. And Victoria, you may have a few words to say. This is Victoria Dingle, our Executive Director.
Well, thank you. That was delightful. And as a person who derives a lot of joy from, selecting things, having a reaction to what you see, and that you want to take it home with you, objects that is, of course. And it makes a world of difference in your apartment. And to think about how does it reflect you? And one of our board members who passed away at 101 years of age had a quintessential New York apartment that I would love going to. First of all, her conversation, but just her life story was so visible. And for anybody who would like to look, those are 2,000 of her books from her library, the alcove back there, and her printing presses. And it tells the story of Penny Spector. And even here at the General Society, if it wasn't for people who, for example, John Mossman, who donated a lock collection, which took 20 years to amass in the beginning of the 1900s, and he did a fine job. It's brought so much joy. So thank you for bringing joy to us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Victoria, could you pass the posters over? We just have a little memento for you both of tonight. We have, and indeed, we've gone wild and we've got your poster each.
Thank you, that's so nice.
So again, so many thanks to Monica and Jill. Again, I just want to mention this wonderful book is available for purchase. You have, our in-person audience will have seen some of our upcoming programs, because this is just the first of many. But I do want to, a special note, next week we have a lecture called Detroit Steel, which is about the original designers and stylists of cars in the 1920s. And I feel like it's going to be another very special lecture. So we do hope to see you again. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Our in-person audience, please join us for a glass of wine while you're purchasing the book. And our online audience, we look forward to seeing you in the future.
And just one other thing about Detroit Steel Artists, fantastic lecture. This engineer it was his first book and it's won multiple awards, a beautiful coffee table book. And one of the people that's showcased in the book in automobile design is Ray Dietrich, who went to the Mechanics Institute and took our carriage drafting program and would become an automobile designer. Fascinating. But he would also go on to design the Gibson Kadar. So there's lots of good stories coming next week. So please join us. Thank you. But yes.
And we're going to go to the back table to sign books. So if
exactly.
you want to say hi or talk to us, just come back there instead of.
Perfect. And thank you for the great stories you shared tonight. So thank you very much.